I'm joined now by Margaret Beckett, who was in the cabinet in the run-up to the war, Siming Campbell, who resolutely opposed British involvement, Sarah Chapman, whose brother died in the war, and from Washington by John Bolton, who served in the Bush administration, including as UN ambassador. Sarah Chapman, I noticed that when Mr. Blair was asked about his regrets, just there, you put your head in your hands. Why?
Because it's painful to hear that. Went there with an open mind. I didn't expect any revelations. I certainly didn't expect to get any openness or truth. He didn't fail to deliver in his polished political performance. But to say that there was regrets, within that kind of remit, really, certainly as bereaved families, we were looking for at least acknowledgement of the suffering that we, as a country, so those of us who have lost loved ones, and those of us that kind of now support the troops and really feel really the reality of what's going on with our troops then and still now today.
Margaret Beckett, were you surprised that the Prime Minister didn't express, at least, or former Prime Minister didn't express at least some regret for the loss of life?
Only for about half a second, and then I realised that the terrible danger that we're in with all this interpretation of words all the time. I have not the slightest shadow of doubt that, like every single one of us, he regrets every death that there was on the side of our troops or in the wider population or whatever. But the minute he says he regrets, that will be taken, twisted, blown out of all proportion. And the last thing he would want is for people who have lost loved ones in the war to think that he's saying they died for no good cause.
So, I mean, do you take that point that, you know, if he'd said it in that way, as Margaret Beckett says, you know, the headlines would be Tony Blair backtracks or something, and it would have made the sacrifice of many, many people seem to some people to be worthless?
I think he missed an opportunity. I take a different view from Margaret Beckett. Of course, politicians are used to their words being misinterpreted and twisted. But that was right at the very end of 6 hours of evidence. He was asked a direct question by the chairman of the inquiry. I think he missed an opportunity to express sympathy for those who had lost loved ones.
John Bolton, there were all kinds of interesting bits to this. I was really struck by what he said was the 2010 question, which was, if we had not removed Saddam Hussein in 2003, would the world be any safer in 2010? No, it wouldn't. I mean, what did you think of that?
Well, of course, the world would have been much more dangerous had we left Saddam in power. There's no doubt that he would have sought nuclear weapons as soon as he was free from UN sanctions and weapons inspectors. He had kept together over 1,000 scientists and technicians he called his nuclear mujahideen, and he would have been on the path. Not only that, Libya, which gave up its nuclear weapons program when Muammar Gaddafi feared the same fate as Saddam Hussein, undoubtedly would have continued its progress toward nuclear weapons, and perhaps others would as well. I think it was a very pertinent question that Tony Blair put.
Sir Ming, and also that raised the specter. He was very tough on Iran as well. And if you followed the reasoning that Ambassador Bolton just said there and that the former Prime Minister was saying, we could have had two potentially nuclear powers in that area. It would have been disastrous for us in 2010.
Yes, but this is speculation. And where do you stop? We know that A.Q. Khan of Pakistan went round quite a few countries in the world unloading the information by which to construct nuclear weapons. Are we going to identify all of these countries and take steps to try and prevent them acquiring nuclear weapons? If we're going to do that, we're going to be very busy indeed. And on Libya, the efforts to persuade Libya to give up weapons of mass destruction predated any question of Iraq. My complaint about the Prime Minister really is that he never addressed the fact that to embark upon this alongside the United States was to ignore the overwhelming international law obstacles. He had to deal with the question of intelligence. He said it was beyond doubt, although we now know it was patchy and sporadic. He acted in a way that was cavalier so far as the legal implications of this were concerned, nor did he ever fully come clean about the nature of the promises he made to George W. Bush, and of course we've never seen the private exchange of correspondence upon
let's bring in
which
Margaret
these are
Beckett,
based.
because I know Margaret Beckett will dispute most of that. I mean, in terms of the legality, though, I mean, it was suggested that the Attorney General, Peter Goldsmith, wanted to brief the full Cabinet on how finely balanced the legal judgments were in this matter, but that was vetoed because it might have leaked out. I mean, the suggestion was that you and the Cabinet weren't fully informed about everything, including these very complicated legal questions.
I'm glad you asked me that, because I was thinking about it this afternoon, because I noticed, listening to the inquiry, and they asked me briefly about this myself, that they asked Tony Blair why the Cabinet didn't discuss in more depth when the Attorney General put his formal view. But what I think probably none of us have ever said is that actually we had had a very full and comprehensive and detailed explanation from both Tony and Jack over a period of weeks, long before we got to the time of taking the decision to go to send troops in. So we knew all about the implications of the different resolutions and what people had said in the negotiation and what it might mean and how you could interpret it. The whole Cabinet was familiar with all that. So of course we didn't take a decision like that lightly or frivolously.
Sarah Chapman, the Cabinet was informed.
Well, it depends if you look at the Cabinet as the Cabinet's maybe as it should have been, and maybe not the cherry-picked advisors that were placed onto that Cabinet. You know, the removal of the chance to actually fully debate, certainly the legal implications, by having Lord Goldsmith in the Cabinet to actually be able to debate with the Cabinet as full, basically is, I think, something that has blown a large hole into this, as far as I'm concerned.
I don't know whether Sarah is really aware, because it's only come out very recently, because you don't normally talk about things that happen at Cabinet. But the Cabinet, on no less than 24 occasions, discussed these issues in depth and at length over many weeks. So this picture that's been painted by people who were never at the Cabinet, that we somehow didn't talk about it, is nonsense.
Legality lay right at the very heart of this. And we now know that the legal advisors in the Foreign Office took the view that it was illegal for Great Britain to participate in something of this kind. We now know that the Attorney General produced an opinion dated the 7th of March which set out all of the doubts and the reservations with regard to legality.
But we also know that the Attorney General changed his mind.
We also know the Cabinet never saw that document. What the Cabinet eventually saw was a document on the 17th of March as the debate began, which set out on one page the belief that it was legal to go to war.
I want to bring in Ambassador Bolton again, and just on the thoughts about relations between the United States and Britain over this. I mean, there was no secret deal signed in blood, according to Mr. Blair, but we were always shoulder to shoulder with the Americans. And President Bush gave him, Tony Blair, a way out if the British had wanted it. Is that the way you understand it?
I want to come back to the legality issue. I think this is very important. This was a very easy question. And to the extent you've got a lot of lawyers in the United Kingdom who can't find a way for Britain lawfully to use force to defend itself against the kind of threat that a regime like Saddam's posed, indicates that you're on a road toward national suicide. This was unambiguous, in my view, both as a matter of American law, which I was concerned about, and to the extent that anybody cares about it, international law. And
but American law is different.
Can I finish, please,
yes,
sir?
Of course.
Do you mind? All of this chatter about international law, in fact, was what drove Prime Minister Blair toward what I think was his greatest vulnerability, of trying to show that Saddam's weapons capability was an imminent threat. That pushed him and the British government and then the American government back to seeking Resolution 1441.
Okay.
We didn't need that resolution at all.
Well, American law is different on this matter. I think in 1998 there was a piece of legislation went through the Congress which had the effect of saying that the policy of the American government should be regime change. Now, regime change is illegal under Article 2 of the United Nations Charter. The British government could not possibly act in that way.
We've only got, Ambassador Bolton, we've only got a minute left. I just wanted to bring in Margaret Beckett. One other thing that Mr. Blair said. He said, we didn't end up with a humanitarian disaster. That is absolutely not how it is seen in Iraq and surrounding countries.
Oh, I think you're wrong about that. I think what he meant, and Jeff Hoon, if I recall correctly, and others have referred to this, there was an understanding that there could be, I mean, after all, we were told that the Iraqi people were 60% dependent on the World Food Programme, I think it was, for their food. There could have been a breakdown of the supply of food, of water, of any electricity, a complete collapse of the structures of civil society.
Well, isn't that pretty much what happened?
No,
Really?
what happened was that people, first of all, it was in a worse condition than anybody thought. And second, as fast as we tried to repair and improve it, other people blew it up, because the last thing they wanted was a stable, successful Iraq.
OK, we'll leave it there. Thank you all very much. Now, two of the Chilcot Inquiry panel are distinguished historians, of course, and there is no doubt that the Iraq War ranks alongside Suez in 1956 as one of the great historical events in British post-war history. But after this inquiry and all the others, have these matters been put to rest? Is there a lasting political legacy for the next Prime Minister and the one after that? Is Iraq still a relevant political issue even? I'm joined now by two top political commentators, Steve Richards of The Independent and Fraser Nelson, who's editor of The Spectator. Is it still a relevant political issue? I mean, this was very interesting and very important, but people are not going to be voting on that in 2010.
People vote on all sorts of things, including whether they are still angry with the government for the Iraq War. And I do think that in bringing this back up, Gordon Brown, in having this inquiry, he has actually raised all these memories which were fading. And now we've got Blair himself. Gordon Brown's going to be in the chair this time next month. And I don't see how it can do him any favours, but there are very relevant issues. One thing which nobody has discussed, not even Blair was talking about, was Basra and the way which we basically let down those people, we abandoned them to the militiamen. That was Britain's responsibility, which we reneged upon. The Chilcot Inquiry has given us information we never had before about how bad things were. It was a chapter of history that was never opened until now. So I do think that this is relevant, because if we are to remain a war-fighting country rather than a peacekeeping military, as Mr. Blair puts it, then we need to know, why do we make mistakes? Why did we lose? And to me, that was Blair's sin, not lying, but losing.
But haven't most people already made up their mind? They made up their mind either this was an illegal war and we were against it, or actually this was justified, there were threats, and we needed to do something. And it didn't change very many people's minds today.
I suspect, and so therefore it's not going to be a sort of decisive issue in the election, but there's no doubt at all that it's a sort of background hum in the build-up to the election and will reinforce certain impressions about the way this government has projected information and so on. And if people think this government is full of liars, that will be reinforced. Others will take a different view. So it's there, but it won't be decisive. It really won't be decisive.
Did you think there was a legacy thing going on here? This was him justifying himself to history, among other among other people, including tomorrow's newspapers.
You get the impression he'd answered these questions in his head 1,000 times in the last 4 or 5 years. And this was his mastermind specialist subject, Tony Blair. He was there completely on top of his brief with a stack full of notes. And sure, he has legitimized it to himself. He must get asked it all the time. So I don't think he was, and that's why he didn't apologise or even come close to it, because he doesn't think he's anything to be sorry for, including the screw up in Basra.
Did you agree with Margaret Beckett's point there that once you start apologising, people unpick it and it gets worse? Because there are others who would say, well, look, you know, this was a matter of decision. It wasn't evil versus good. It was somebody who perhaps took some decisions which were wrong.
Contrition becomes impossible when you take troops to war and people get killed. Because if you think about it afterwards, for a leader to say, look, mistakes were made, I'm sorry, you're actually sort of implying that the deaths were unnecessary. And so for contrition is impossible. There are still, though, I think, unanswered questions. The first part of the session today was very interesting, I think, where Tony Blair said very early on, after September the 11th, we had to deal with Saddam. Why? Saddam wasn't connected with September the 11th. I think there's general acceptance about that. And that, to me, really is the unanswered question.
But there was the perception of the threat. You know, if this guy is bad, if he has WMD, he could see what happened on September 11th and do very, very bad things. That was the
But there were about 3 ifs there in your question. And that, to me, seems to me fundamental. We know the American administration reached that conclusion within hours of September the 11th. Tony Blair did so as well. But was that because he was determined to stick with America or because he felt it with absolute conviction? I'm not sure what the sequence was, but from that moment on, it seems to me that his course was absolutely set. Once you have decided that September the 11th meant you had to deal with Saddam in alliance with the divided Bush administration, everything else was almost inevitable, and he's been justifying it ever since. But I still don't know why he took that original decision.
Where do you think this leaves the next Prime Minister, whoever it is, if it's David Cameron or if it's Gordon Brown again, or whatever happens? I mean, are future Prime Ministers going to look at this and think, this is how my judgments are going to be unpicked?
Certainly. I cannot see Britain embarking on another expeditionary mission like this for the foreseeable future. The public opinion has been turned against it so much. If this is what this is all about, this feeling that we were misled and lied and the whole war was a deceit, it certainly wasn't, in my view, but that opinion means it's going to be so much more difficult. If say, for example, if Tony Blair is right and Iran does kick off and there is some kind of international force needs to be sent there, David Cameron, if he's Prime Minister, is really going to have to think hard. Am I really going to get permission to send troops out there given what's happened in Iraq? I think this will tie the hands of Prime Ministers for years to come.
Do you agree?
I agree with Fraser about this, and this is really quite sort of profound consequences of this, is that actually I think Tony Blair and Gordon Brown reached the conclusion that a Labour government could never say no to America in relation to war, but as a result of what has happened, Cameron and a future Labour leader probably can't say yes to America in relation to war, and that is a very, very interesting consequence.
Thank you both very much.